the Lion's Empire, betrayed. From within, in 1849, the most disciplined army in Asia laid down its weapons, not because it was defeated in battle, but because its own generals had already sold the outcome to the enemy before the fighting began. Archaeologists excavating the battlefield sites of the Anglo-Sikh Wars near Firozepur in Punjab have found something that changes the standard account. British military records recovered and cross-referenced with Sikh court documents in Lahore confirm that at least 2 senior Sikh commanders received direct payments from the East India Company in the weeks before the battles they were supposed to win. The soldiers they commanded fought with extraordinary courage and died in extraordinary numbers. Their generals collected their fees and watched. The Sikh Empire at its peak stretched from the Indus River to the Himalayas, held the Koh-i-Noor diamond and fielded an army that had driven Afghan forces back across the Khyber Pass. The British called it the most dangerous military power they had ever faced in Asia. It lasted 50 years. One man held it together. When he died, his own court destroyed it in 10. So how does the army that never lost a war end up losing an empire, and who exactly was responsible? To understand what Ranjit Singh built, you first need to understand what Punjab looked like before he arrived, because the Punjab of the late 18th century was not a territory waiting peacefully for a strong ruler. It was a landscape of continuous, overlapping violence that had been absorbing invasions, civil wars, and famines for nearly a century without resolution. The word Punjab means 5 rivers in Persian, a reference to the 5 tributaries of the Indus that flow through the territory, the Jhelum, Chenab, Ravi, Beas and Sutlej. These rivers made Punjab the most agriculturally productive region in the northwestern subcontinent. The alluvial soil deposited by centuries of seasonal flooding was extraordinarily fertile, capable of producing wheat, cotton and sugarcane at yields that sustained dense populations and generated significant agricultural surplus. This productivity was both Punjab's greatest asset and the primary reason it had been invaded repeatedly for 2,000 years by Persians, Greeks, Kushans, Huns, Arabs, Turks, Mongols, and Afghans, each drawn by the same combination of agricultural wealth and strategic position. By the mid-18th century, the Mughal Empire's central authority had collapsed so completely that Punjab had no effective government at all. The Afghan Durrani Empire under Ahmad Shah raided the region repeatedly, extracting tribute and looting cities without establishing permanent administration. Local Afghan governors appointed by the Durranis competed with each other for control of revenue streams rather than providing security. The population of Punjab's cities, Lahore, Amritsar, Multan, Peshawar, experienced the consequences of this power vacuum directly. Irregular taxation by whoever controlled their district at any given moment, forced conscription for armies whose loyalty ran to their immediate commanders rather than to any political authority, and the constant risk that this year's protector would become next year's predator. The Sikh community had existed in Punjab since the 15th century, founded by Guru Nanak, and developed through a succession of 10 gurus whose teachings combined elements of Hindu devotional practice and Islamic monotheism into a distinct religious tradition emphasizing equality, service, and the rejection of caste hierarchy. By the 18th century, the Sikh community had developed a military organization called the Dal Khalsa, the Khalsa Army, organized into 12 independent confederacies called Mizls, each controlling specific territories and operating under its own leadership. The Missis system provided the Sikh community with genuine military capacity, enough to resist Durrani raids, to carve out territorial control in specific districts, and to maintain the security of the Golden Temple at Amritsar, the religion's most sacred site. But the Mizls were also deeply competitive with each other, spending as much military energy on intermisnal conflicts as on external threats. Punjab needed not just a military force, but a political vision capable of unifying those forces under a single authority. In 1780, that vision was born in a village near Gujranwala, in the form of a child who would lose sight in one eye to smallpox before his first birthday, and who would, by his 19th year, control the city of Lahore. Ranjit Singh was born on November 13, 1780, into the family of Mahar Singh, chief of the Sukha Chakya Misl, one of the 12 Sikh confederacies competing for control of Punjab. His father died when Ranjit Singh was 12, leaving him nominal chief of the Misl at an age when most boys in his position became pawns in the political calculations of their guardians. Ranjit Singh declined to be a pawn. The smallpox that had taken his left eye in infancy had also scarred his face severely, and the portraits that survived from his reign. He reportedly disliked being portrayed, and only a handful of contemporary images exist, show a man whose physical appearance was unremarkable and whose bearing suggested none of the conventional markers of royal charisma. What observers consistently recorded instead was the quality of his attention. He listened more than he spoke. He remembered everything he heard, and he had an intuitive capacity for identifying the specific combination of incentive, threat, and personal relationship that would move any particular individual in the direction he needed them to go. His consolidation of control over the Sukha Misl through his teenage years demonstrated both his military competence and his political method. He did not simply defeat rivals. He co-opted them, offering defeated enemies honourable terms, absorbing their fighters into his own forces, and converting potential enemies into clients through a consistent pattern of generosity that was expensive in the short term and invaluable in the long term. By the time he was 18, the Sukha Misl had grown from a mid-sized misl into the dominant military force in central Punjab. The capture of Lahore in July 1799 was the pivotal moment. Lahore was Punjab's largest city, its historical capital, and the symbolic centre of political legitimacy in the region. Whoever controlled Lahore controlled the narrative of who was governing Punjab. It had been in Afghan hands, administered through a governor appointed by the Durrani court in Kabul. Ranjit Singh's campaign to take it was as much political as military. He negotiated with Lahore's population and its existing power structures in parallel with his military approach, ensuring that the city was prepared to accept new governance rather than resist it. When his forces entered Lahore, they entered a city that had already decided to accept him. He was 19 years old. Within the year, the Durrani court in Kabul, recognizing the reality of what had happened, formally acknowledged his authority over Lahore. In 1801, on the day of Baisakhi, the Sikh New Year, Ranjit Singh was proclaimed Maharaja, Great King of Punjab. He was 20 years old, controlled the most important city in northwestern India, and had already demonstrated the combination of military aggression and political sophistication that would define his reign for the next 4 decades. The Punjab that Ranjit Singh unified was not simply an agricultural territory. It was, by the geography of Asia, the single most strategically significant piece of land between Persia and the Gangetic Plain, and understanding why explains both how the Sikh Empire became as powerful as it did and why every major power in Asia eventually directed its attention toward controlling it. The 5 rivers that named the territory were not merely irrigation sources. They were transportation networks, defensive lines, and the organising principle of Punjab's agricultural economy simultaneously. The alluvial plains between the rivers, called dobes, meaning 2 waterlands, were naturally divided into distinct agricultural zones whose productivity varied with the timing of seasonal flooding and the depth of the water table. Farmers in Punjab had developed sophisticated irrigation systems. The Kari's underground channels borrowed from Persian engineering and the surface canal networks that extended cultivation well beyond the natural flood zones. The agricultural output this system produced was extraordinary by South Asian standards. Punjab's wheat was the highest quality available in the subcontinent, and its cotton-supported textile industries that supplied markets from Central Asia to Bengal. The livestock raised on Punjab's grasslands, particularly the horses bred in the districts north of Lahore, were among the finest cavalry animals in Asia, comparable in quality to the Central Asian horses that Ahmad Shah Durrani had imported at great expense. Ranjit Singh's cavalry was mounted on horses bred and trained in his own territory, which gave him a logistical advantage over any opponent who needed to import horses from outside the region. Lahore's position made it the natural hub of this economic system. The city sat on the Ravi River at the point where routes from Kabul through the Khyber Pass, from Delhi through the Gangetic Plain, and from Multan through the Indus Valley converged. Every significant overland movement of goods between Central Asia and northern India passed through or near Lahore. The customs revenue from this transit trade was a significant component of the Sikh Empire's finances, and controlling it meant controlling the economic information that flowed with the goods. Prices in distant markets, the movements of merchant communities, the financial positions of trading families, whose networks extended across the entire region. The Khyber Pass, the narrow defile through the Hindu Kush mountains that connects the Afghan plateau to the Punjab plains, was the specific geographic feature that defined Punjab's strategic vulnerability. Every major invasion of the subcontinent from the northwest had come through the Khyber. Mahmud of Ghazni had used it, Tamerlane had used it, Babur had used it, Nader Shah had used it, Ahmad Shah Durrani had used it repeatedly. Controlling the eastern approaches to the Khyber was equivalent to controlling access to northern India from Central Asia, which is why Ranjit Singh's eventual seizure of Peshawar, the city commanding the Khyber's eastern entrance, was the single most strategically significant territorial acquisition of his reign. Ranjit Singh's transformation of Punjab from a collection of competing Miz territories into a functioning empire required solving three problems simultaneously: building a military force capable of projecting power beyond Punjab's existing borders, creating an administrative system capable of governing the territories that military force acquired, and financing both without destroying the agricultural economy that was the foundation of everything else. His solution to the military problem was one of the most remarkable institutional innovations in South Asian history. The traditional Sikh Khalsa force was formidable in defence and raiding, but not organised for sustained offensive operations or the siege warfare required to capture fortified cities. Ranjit Singh recognised this limitation clearly and responded to it in a way that his contemporaries found both pragmatic and surprising. He hired European military professionals to redesign his army. The most significant of these European officers were Jean-Baptiste Ventura, an Italian veteran of Napoleon's campaigns who had served in Persia before reaching Lahore, and Jean-François Allard, a French cavalry officer who had also served under Napoleon. Both arrived at Ranjit Singh's court in 1822 and were given authority to organise and train new units of the Sikh army, the Fauji Khas, or elite force along European lines. Ventura organised infantry battalions drilled in European tactical formations, using the linear tactics that had proven decisive in the Napoleonic Wars. Allard built a cavalry force organised around European squadron structures and equipped with standardised weapons and equipment. The results were visible within years. The Fauji Khas that emerged from this training programme was capable of the kind of coordinated multi-arm operations, infantry, cavalry and artillery working together in planned sequences, that neither Afghan tribal armies nor the remaining Mughal tradition forces of northern India could match. When this force was combined with the existing Khalsa cavalry in campaigns against the Afghans in the 1820s and 1830s, it proved consistently superior. His administrative system was built around a recognition that ethnic and religious diversity was a resource to be managed rather than a problem to be eliminated. Muslims, who constituted the majority of Punjab's population, served at every level of the Sikh Empire's civil administration, including as senior ministers and provincial governors. Hindus administered the empire's financial systems, where their established expertise in commercial accounting was irreplaceable. Ranjit Singh himself was Sikh, and the religious establishment at Amritsar received lavish imperial patronage, but the state he governed was deliberately non-sectarian in its administrative practices. The tax system he built was based on a detailed land survey, the first systematic cadastral survey of Punjab's agricultural land that assessed each plot's productivity and assigned tax obligations accordingly. This was administratively sophisticated and politically significant. It meant that tax assessments were based on documented land quality rather than the arbitrary demands of local officials, which reduced the corruption that had characterized Punjab's taxation under every previous authority and generated a more reliable revenue stream for the imperial government. The military force that Ranjit Singh built was, by the assessment of British military observers who studied it carefully during the 1830s and 1840s, the most formidable army in Asia that was not under European command. This was not a casual compliment. The British East India Company had been expanding across the subcontinent for nearly a century by that point, defeating successive Indian armies with a consistency that had produced genuine institutional confidence in British military superiority. The Sikh army made them genuinely uncertain. The Khalsa cavalry, the arm that had been the foundation of Sikh military power since the Misl period, reached its peak organisation under Ranjit Singh's reign. Sikh horsemen were recruited from a community with a centuries-long tradition of cavalry warfare, where horsemanship was a cultural practice as much as a military skill, and where the combination of personal religious commitment and communal martial identity created soldiers of exceptional motivation. The standard Khalsa cavalryman carried a curved sword, a shield, and either a matchlock or flintlock firearm, and was trained to operate effectively both in the close-range shock action of a mounted charge and the more dispersed skirmishing style that characterized campaign operations in Punjab's varied terrain. The artillery that the European officers helped organize was the component of the Sikh military that most alarmed British observers. Ranjit Singh had established cannon foundries in Lahore that produced guns of quality comparable to East India Company ordnance, and his artillery corps had been trained to the standard of professional European practice. The guns were maintained with a discipline unusual in Asian armies of the period, and their deployment in battle followed organized tactical principles rather than the improvised positioning that characterized most South Asian artillery of the era. The campaign to capture Peshawar and extend Sikh control over the Khyber approaches was the most challenging military operation of Ranjit Singh's reign, and the one that demonstrated his army's full capability most clearly. The Afghan forces defending the Peshawar region were experienced mountain fighters with detailed knowledge of terrain that the Sikh army was entering from outside. The repeated Sikh campaigns into the Peshawar Valley between 1818 and 1823, culminating in the formal annexation of Peshawar in 1834, involved some of the most difficult fighting of the period, conducted in terrain that negated many of the advantages that European trained discipline provided on open plains. The victory at Peshawar was strategically transformative. For the first time in recorded history, a Punjab-based power had pushed Afghan control back to the western side of the Khyber Pass and established a defensive frontier that closed the traditional invasion route from Central Asia. The Durrani Empire, which had raided Punjab repeatedly under Ahmad Shah, was now reduced to defending its own territory against Sikh pressure. The strategic balance of power between Punjab and Afghanistan had reversed completely within 3 decades of Ranjit Singh's accession. The discipline that made all of this possible was genuinely extraordinary. Contemporary accounts from European visitors to the Sikh camp during military campaigns describe an organization that compared favorably with professional European armies. Regular drill, maintained equipment, organized logistics, and a command structure that functioned through established procedures rather than depending entirely on the personal presence of senior commanders. Ranjit Singh was the only ruler of a major empire in 19th century Asia who was genuinely, consistently, and by contemporary accounts sincerely indifferent to the religious identity of the people he governed. This was not a calculated political strategy, though it had significant political benefits. It was, by the testimony of everyone who knew him personally, simply how he operated. The court at Lahore under Ranjit Singh was one of the most religiously diverse governing environments in the world at that time. His most trusted military commander was a Muslim, Mr. Diwan Chand, whose career under Ranjit Singh spanned 2 decades and included command of the campaigns that captured Multan and Kashmir. His finance minister for much of his reign was a Hindu, Diwan Sawan Mal, whose administrative competence in managing the empire's tax revenues was irreplaceable. His European military advisors were Christian. The Sikh religious establishment at Amritsar was central to the empire's symbolic legitimacy, and Ranjit Singh himself participated in religious practices from multiple traditions, visiting Hindu temples and Muslim shrines as naturally as he observed Sikh ceremonies. The Golden Temple at Amritsar, the Harmandir Sahib, received the most direct expression of his religious patronage. The temple had been the spiritual centre of Sikh faith since its founding in the 16th century. But the actual structure had been damaged and partially destroyed during the Afghan raids of the 18th century. Ranjit Singh funded a comprehensive reconstruction beginning in 1802 that included covering the temple's upper stories and dome in gold leaf. The origin of the name Golden Temple, which the structure had not previously been called. The total gold applied, according to historical accounts, was approximately 750 kilograms, drawn from the imperial treasury at Lahore. The reconstructed temple became one of the most visually extraordinary religious buildings in Asia and remains the most important site in Sikh faith to the present day. His personal lifestyle was notably inconsistent with the austere standards that Sikh religious teaching recommended. He drank heavily. The chronicles record a preference for a strong distilled spirit mixed with meat, extracts and crushed pearls that his physicians apparently provided as a kind of medicinal tonic, and that he consumed in quantities that alarmed his court. He maintained a large harem. He spent on personal luxury in ways that contrasted with the relative simplicity of the Sikh gurus whose tradition he claimed to continue. None of this undermined his political authority because his subjects judged him by the outcomes his governance produced, rather than by adherence to religious standards that no ruler before him had consistently maintained either. Under his rule, Punjab was secure, prosperous, and respected by every neighbouring power. The combination of personal accessibility, he held regular open durbars where any subject could approach him with a petition, and demonstrated political effectiveness created a loyalty that was genuinely personal, not simply institutional. The 40 years of Ranjit Singh's reign were, by most measures available to historians, the most prosperous and secure period in Punjab's recorded history. The security that his military established along Punjab's borders and internal roads made possible a level of agricultural investment, commercial activity and cultural development that the previous century of continuous violence had prevented entirely. The agricultural economy that underpinned this prosperity was transformed during his reign by a combination of land security and administrative reform. Farmers who had previously been unable to invest in long-term improvements, irrigation channels, orchard plantings, soil improvement, because their land might be seized by the next passing army, now had sufficient confidence in the continuity of their tenure to make those investments. The land survey that his administrator conducted in the 1820s and 1830s provided a documented record of land ownership and productivity that protected farmers from arbitrary dispossession and gave the government a reliable basis for tax assessment. Women's position in Sikh society during this period was shaped by a specific tension within the tradition. The teachings of the Sikh gurus had explicitly rejected caste discrimination and had affirmed in principle the spiritual equality of women with men, a more direct statement of gender equality than most religious traditions of the era maintained. In practice, the social customs of Punjab, many of which were shared with the Hindu and Muslim communities of the region and predated Sikh religious teaching, imposed significant restrictions on women's public roles, property rights, and freedom of movement. What was distinctive in Ranjit Singh's court was the degree to which women of his family exercised genuine political influence. His mother-in-law, Sada Kaur, had been a political and military figure in her own right during the Messal period, commanding troops and negotiating alliances with a directness that most male political actors of the period would have found difficult to sustain. She had been instrumental in supporting Ranjit Singh's early rise and was acknowledged even by those who eventually came into conflict with her as one of the most capable political minds of the Punjab court. The urban life of Lahore during Ranjit Singh's reign was described by European visitors in terms that consistently conveyed surprise at the city's vitality and diversity. Baron Charles Hugel, an Austrian botanist who visited Lahore in 1836, described a city of approximately 100,000 people whose streets combined the architectural heritage of the Mughal period with the commercial energy of a functioning imperial capital. The bazaars were active with the trade goods of multiple continents: British manufactured textiles from Bengal, Afghan dried fruits and horses, Central Asian metalwork, and the local products of Punjab's manufacturing districts. Lahore, under Ranjit Singh's rule, was the most cosmopolitan city in South Asia outside of Calcutta, a place where the architectural layers of successive civilizations were simultaneously visible and where the court's deliberate inclusiveness had created an urban culture that drew talented individuals from across the continent. The city's physical landscape was defined by its Mughal inheritance. The Lahore Fort, whose construction had begun under Akbar in the 16th century and been expanded and refined by every subsequent Mughal emperor, was one of the most impressive palace-fortress complexes in Asia, comparable in scale and craftsmanship to the Red Fort in Delhi and the Agra Fort. Ranjit Singh occupied and expanded the Lahore Fort as his primary residence, adding the Hazari Bagh Garden between the fort and the Badshahi Mosque and constructing the Baradari Pavilion in its centre, a structure that still stands as one of the finest examples of Sikh-era architecture in Pakistan. The Badshahi Mosque, built by the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb in 1673, and designed to hold a congregation of approximately 100,000 worshippers, was the largest mosque in the world at the time of its construction and remained among the largest for nearly 2 centuries. Ranjit Singh's relationship with this monument was complex and revealing. He used part of the mosque compound for military purposes, stabling horses in the courtyard and storing ammunition in some of the outbuildings, a repurposing that Muslim residents of Lahore found offensive. He did not, however, destroy or systematically damage the structure, and it remained substantially intact throughout his reign. Amritsar, the religious capital of the Sikh Empire, 50 kilometers east of Lahore, was transformed by Ranjit Singh's patronage from a significant religious centre into one of the most impressive sacred landscapes in Asia. The reconstruction of the Golden Temple was the centerpiece of this transformation, but Ranjit Singh also funded extensive development of the city's surrounding infrastructure. Roads connecting Amritsar to Lahore and to the major trade routes of Punjab, market facilities that made Amritsar a commercial centre as well as a religious one, and defensive works that gave the city some protection against the raids that had previously been a constant threat. Peshawar, after its annexation in 1834, became the western anchor of the empire and the point at which Sikh military power met Afghan resistance most directly. The city had been a significant urban centre since at least the Kushan period in the 1st century CE and had served as the eastern capital of successive Afghan dynasties. Under Sikh governance, Peshawar maintained its role as the commercial gateway to the Khyber Pass, though the Afghan population of the city and its surrounding districts never fully reconciled itself to Sikh rule, and the administration of Peshawar required a continuous and expensive military presence that stretched the empire's resources in ways that became more significant as Ranjit Singh aged. The Sikh faith that provided the Khalsa Army its identity and the Sikh Empire its legitimating ideology was, at the time of the empire's formation, less than 3 centuries old, young by the standards of the world's major religious traditions, but already possessed of a distinct theology, a sacred scripture, a defined community of practice, and a history of martyrdom that had given it both internal coherence and a powerful narrative of resistance against persecution. The tradition traced its origins to Guru Nanak, born in 1469 in the Punjab village of Talwandi, who taught a path of devotion to a single formless God that explicitly rejected the caste system of Hindu tradition and the religious exclusivism of both Hinduism and Islam. Nanak's core teaching that the divine was accessible to all human beings regardless of their birth status, gender or religious background, and that the appropriate response to the divine presence was service and devotion rather than ritual observance, was radical in the social context of 15th century Punjab, and remained radical in the social context of the 19th century. The tradition had developed through 9 subsequent gurus, each of whom contributed to the evolving shape of Sikh practice and identity. The 10th and final human guru, Gobind Singh, who died in 1708, had taken 2 decisions of permanent consequence for the tradition's subsequent history. First, he formally instituted the Khalsa, the initiated community of Sikhs who underwent a specific initiation ceremony and committed to a code of conduct including the wearing of 5 articles whose Punjabi names all begin with the letter K Kesh, uncut hair, Kara, a steel bracelet, Kanga, a wooden comb, Kachera, a specific style of undergarment, and Kirpan, a ceremonial sword. Second, he declared that after his death, the lineage of living human gurus would end, and the guru's authority would pass to the community as a whole, the Guru Granth Sahib, the sacred scripture, becoming the eternal guru. This transfer of authority had significant political implications. Without a living human guru to provide authoritative leadership, the Sikh community's governance fell to its most capable members by consensus, a structure that worked well during periods of relative stability but generated intense competition during crises. The Misl period, when no single leader commanded universal Sikh loyalty, was one expression of this structural challenge. Ranjit Singh's genius was his ability to claim a form of legitimate authority within this system without claiming the specific religious authority that the tradition reserved for the scripture alone. The relationship between the Khalsa Army's religious identity and its military effectiveness was direct and functional. Soldiers who understood their service as a form of devotion, who fought under the banner of Ik Onkar, the one God, and who were prepared for death as a religious event rather than simply a personal catastrophe, were soldiers of a different motivational quality than mercenaries or conscripts. The British officers who fought against the Khalsa in the Anglo-Sikh Wars consistently noted its quality in their accounts, describing Sikh soldiers who continued fighting under fire that had broken other Indian armies and who required direct physical suppression rather than simply the demonstration of overwhelming force. The Sikh Empire's technological capabilities were, in several specific areas, comparable to or ahead of what the British East India Company was deploying in the same period. A fact that the company's military planners took seriously in their assessments, and that helps explain why the British approached the Sikh frontier with unusual caution for nearly 2 decades after Ranjit Singh's death. The Lahore arsenal, the cannon foundry and weapons manufacturing facility established under Ranjit Singh and expanded under his successors, was producing artillery of quality that surprised British observers when it was captured after the Anglo-Sikh Wars. The cannon cast in Lahore used bronze alloys and casting techniques that produced guns of consistent bore and reliable performance, and the Sikh artillery corps that operated them had been trained to European standards of gunnery by the French and Italian officers in imperial service. When British artillery officers examined captured Sikh guns at Lahore in 1849, their assessments recorded genuine respect for the manufacturing quality. The Sikh Empire's intelligence system was one of its less celebrated but genuinely sophisticated capabilities. Ranjit Singh maintained an extensive network of informants across Punjab and in the neighbouring territories, British India, Afghanistan, and the Central Asian states, that provided him with political and military information of remarkable quality. His court maintained detailed records of British troop movements in northern India, British diplomatic communications with Afghan rulers, and the positions and loyalty assessments of every significant military commander in the region. British intelligence officers who gained access to some of these records after 1849 found them more comprehensive than they expected. The fortress engineering that defended the Sikh Empire's key cities and border positions drew on a tradition of Indian military architecture going back centuries, adapted to the realities of gunpowder warfare. The fortifications at Lahore, Gobindgarh, at Amritsar, and the border positions along the Sutlej River incorporated bastion designs that allowed flanking fire against attackers, a configuration that reflected knowledge of European military engineering, presumably absorbed through the French and Italian officers who served in the Sikh army. What the Sikh Empire lacked was not technical capability, but industrial scale. The Lahore arsenal could produce high-quality artillery, but could not produce it at the rate that British manufacturing capacity could supply replacements for losses. The Sikh military could match British equipment quality in specific categories, but could not sustain equipment losses over an extended campaign. This asymmetry, quality versus scale, was a structural disadvantage that Ranjit Singh recognised and that drove his consistent policy of avoiding direct military confrontation with the East India Company. His successors, less strategically patient, allowed this disadvantage to become decisive. The British East India Company that faced the Sikh Empire across the Sutlej River frontier was not the same organisation that had landed traders on the Indian coast 2 centuries earlier. By the 1830s and 1840s, it was the effective government of approximately 150 million people, commanded armies of over 200,000 men, and had developed a sophisticated apparatus for gathering intelligence, manipulating local political dynamics, and identifying the specific combination of military pressure and political subversion most likely to produce the territorial outcomes it sought. The company's approach to the Sikh Empire during Ranjit Singh's lifetime was one of careful deterrence, maintaining a military presence on the Sutlej frontier sufficient to discourage Sikh expansion southward, while cultivating diplomatic relationships that kept the frontier stable. The Treaty of Amritsar in 1809, which formalised the Sutlej as the boundary between Sikh and British spheres of influence, was negotiated by Charles Metcalfe on the British side and represented Ranjit Singh's recognition that direct military confrontation with the company was strategically inadvisable. It also represented the company's recognition that Ranjit Singh's military was not an adversary to be taken lightly. What changed after 1839 was the political environment on both sides of the frontier. Ranjit Singh's death removed the one figure whose personal authority had held the Sikh court's competing factions in check, and whose strategic judgment had consistently avoided the traps that British diplomacy was setting. The court that succeeded him was consumed by a succession crisis that within 5 years produced 4 different Maharajas, 2 of whom were minors, and a political environment in which the real power lay with the army's leadership council, the Panchayat, rather than with any figure of recognised political authority. The company's intelligence apparatus monitored this disintegration with close attention. The political agent at Ludhiana, Henry Lawrence, maintained contacts within the Lahore court that gave him detailed information about the competing factions, their financial positions, and their willingness to exchange political support for British backing. The reports he sent to Calcutta during the early 1840s described a court that was simultaneously dangerous. Its army remained formidable and vulnerable. Its political cohesion was deteriorating faster than its military capability. The specific intelligence that was most significant, and whose implications are still debated by historians, concerned the loyalties of senior Sikh military commanders. British records indicate that at least 2 commanders, Lal Singh and Tej Singh, who held the most senior positions in the Khalsa Army during the First Anglo-Sikh War, were in communication with British officers before and during the campaign. The nature of these communications, whether they constituted a direct agreement to ensure British victory or were simply intelligence exchanges whose implications became clear only in retrospect, remains contested. What is clear from battlefield outcomes is that both commanders made decisions during critical engagements that benefited the British and cost the Sikh forces opportunities for decisive victory. The Sikh Empire at its territorial maximum in the years between the annexation of Peshawar in 1834 and Ranjit Singh's death in 1839 covered approximately 200,000 square kilometres, smaller in area than the Durrani Empire at its peak, but far more densely administered, more economically productive, and more militarily capable per square kilometre than any comparable territory in the region. The Koh-i-Noor diamond, which had passed from Ahmad Shah Durrani to his successors and eventually to the Sikh Empire following Ranjit Singh's annexation of the Kashmir and the territories of the deposed Sikh ruler Shah Shuja, sat in Ranjit Singh's personal collection, worn on his arm as a bracelet in an armlet setting that he commissioned specifically for it. His attachment to the stone was reportedly intense, and his court jewellers described him studying it for extended periods and asking repeatedly about its history and the history of those who had possessed it before him. The empire's annual revenue had reached approximately 30 million rupees by the late 1830s, a figure that compared favourably with the revenues of the company's northwestern provinces, and that reflected the genuine economic productivity of Punjab's agricultural and commercial economy. This revenue supported a standing army of approximately 80,000 to 100,000 trained soldiers, one of the largest professional military forces in Asia, along with the administrative, infrastructure and court expenses of a functioning imperial government. The diplomatic relationships that Ranjit Singh had built during four decades of ruling gave the Sikh Empire a recognised position in the regional order that no Punjab-based power had previously achieved. The British maintained a permanent diplomatic mission at Lahore. Persia exchanged ambassadors. Afghanistan, despite the military losses it had absorbed, acknowledged Sikh power over the Peshawar region. The Russian Empire were expanding through Central Asia with Britain for regional influence, watched Sikh strength with interest and maintained communications that alarmed the British Indian government. The personal authority that held this structure together was, however, increasingly carried by a man whose health was failing. Ranjit Singh's drinking had damaged his health progressively throughout his reign, and by the mid-1830s his court was managing his medical condition as a political secret, limiting information about his deteriorating health to avoid destabilising the court's factions, who would begin manoeuvring for post-Ranjit influence the moment his decline became undeniable. When he died on June 27, 1839, after a series of strokes that had progressively incapacitated him over the preceding year, the empire he had built began almost immediately to dismantle itself. The 10 years between Ranjit Singh's death in June 1839 and the formal annexation of Punjab by the East India Company in March 1849 were among the most politically violent decades in Punjab's history, which is a meaningful claim for a territory that had experienced nearly continuous violence for the preceding century. The succession crisis began before Ranjit Singh was buried. His designated heir, Karak Singh, was a man of limited political capacity who became dependent on a favourite minister, Chet Singh Bajwa, within weeks of his accession. The court factions who had been suppressed by Ranjit Singh's authority began operating immediately. Chet Singh was murdered by court conspirators in October 1839, barely 4 months after Ranjit Singh's death. Karak Singh himself died in November 1840, under circumstances that his supporters described as illness and his enemies described as poisoning. His son, now Nihal Singh, died the same day as his father, crushed by a falling gateway arch, an accident that multiple contemporary accounts treated as suspicious and that historians have never definitively resolved. What followed was a sequence of accessions and depositions driven by competing military and court factions rather than any legitimate succession principle. Sher Singh, another of Ranjit Singh's sons, ruled from 1841 to 1843, before being assassinated along with his son by members of the Santhanwalia family during a Durbar meeting. The murderers were themselves killed within hours by troops loyal to the court. The young Duleep Singh, 5 years old at the time of his accession in 1843, and the son whose claimed to be Ranjit Singh's biological offspring was questioned by some court factions, was placed on the throne under the regency of his mother, Rani Jindan, who was in her mid-20s when her son became Maharaja, was one of the most remarkable figures of the entire Sikh Empire period, and her treatment by both the Sikh court factions and the British East India Company reflects the specific ways in which capable women exercising political authority in the 19th century were suppressed by the institutions they threatened. She was intelligent, politically astute, and genuinely committed to maintaining her son's rule against both internal conspirators and external pressure. The British found her sufficiently dangerous that they eventually had her imprisoned and then exiled, and they separated her from her son in 1847, when Duleep Singh was 9 years old. She did not see him again for 13 years. The army's political role during this period was simultaneously the Sikh Empire's greatest internal threat and its most formidable remaining asset. The Khalsa Panchayat, the army's self-governing council, had filled the power vacuum left by the succession crisis, demanding pay, making appointments, and assassinating commanders who challenged its authority. The British watched this development with careful attention, recognizing that an army that controlled its own government was an army that could also decide to surrender its government if the price was right. The First Anglo-Sikh War began in December 1845, when Sikh forces crossed the Sutlej River into British-controlled territory, a crossing that British intelligence had anticipated, and that the company's army in northern India had been quietly prepared to receive for months. What happened in the battles that followed has been debated by military historians for over 170 years, because the battlefield record is inconsistent with the capabilities that both sides were known to possess. The Khalsa Army that crossed the Sutlej in December 1845 was the same force that had driven Afghan armies back across the Khyber Pass and maintained the security of Punjab's frontiers for decades. Its artillery was, by British assessment, superior to the company's guns in some categories. Its soldiers had demonstrated in every previous engagement that they would fight to the death rather than break under fire. The British forces opposing it, while professional and experienced, were not significantly superior in numbers or equipment. And yet the Sikh forces lost every significant engagement of the campaign at Mudki, Ferozeshah, Aliwal, and Zabraon, with a consistency that the casualties on both sides do not entirely explain. At Ferozeshah, where the Sikh artillery was positioned to inflict devastating losses on the advancing British, the guns fell silent at critical moments. At Sobraon, the commander Tej Singh withdrew with his cavalry reserve at the moment when a counterattack might have reversed the battle's outcome. The pattern was clear enough that British officers noted it in their dispatches without drawing the full implication. Someone was ensuring that the British won. The Treaty of Lahore that ended the First Anglo-Sikh War in March 1846 was designed to be a permanent reduction of Sikh power rather than a temporary military settlement. It required the Sikh Empire to cede Kashmir, the mountain territory to the north of Punjab that Ranjit Singh had annexed in 1819, and pay a war indemnity of 15 million rupees. When the empire could not pay the indemnity immediately, the company accepted Kashmir itself as payment and sold it to a Hindu Dogra Raja named Gulab Singh for 7.5 million rupees, a transaction that established the illegal framework whose consequences remain actively contested in the India-Pakistan conflict over Kashmir today. The Koh-i-Noor was transferred to British possession in March 1849 as part of the terms ending the Second Anglo-Sikh War and the formal annexation of Punjab. The 10-year-old Maharaja Duleep Singh signed the document authorizing the transfer, a legal instrument whose validity, given the signer's age and the circumstances under which it was obtained, has been questioned by Sikh advocacy groups and their legal representatives in multiple contexts. Queen Victoria received the diamond later that year. It was recut, reducing its weight from approximately 186 carats to 105.6 carats, and incorporated into the British Crown Jewels, where it remains. The Sikh Empire ended in 1849 as an institutional fact, but it did not end as a cultural or political force, and the specific ways in which its memory has been maintained, contested, and reinterpreted across the 175 years since its dissolution reveal as much about the present as about the past. The most immediate legacy was the Sikh diaspora's relationship with the empire's defeat. The question of betrayal, who sold the Anglo-Sikh Wars to the British, under what circumstances, and for what compensation has never been fully resolved from historical sources, and the political sensitivity of the question has ensured that it remains actively contested. British records from the period, many of which are preserved in the India Office Records collection at the British Library in London, contain correspondence that historians have interpreted differently depending on their methodological and political orientations. Some scholarship, drawing on the timing of payments recorded in company accounts and the battlefield decisions documented in after-action reports, argues that Lal Singh and Tej Singh's actions during the First Anglo-Sikh War constituted deliberate sabotage arranged in advance. Other scholarship is more cautious about inferring intentional betrayal from what might have been incompetence or simple military misjudgment under pressure. What the archival evidence does clearly support is that the British intelligence operation surrounding the Anglo-Sikh Wars was unusually sophisticated, and that the company had more detailed information about Sikh court politics and military dispositions than any purely external observer could have gathered. The political agent reports from Ludhiana and Ferozepur in the years before the wars describe internal Sikh court dynamics with a specificity that implies sources inside the Lahore court who were providing information in exchange for British protection of their post-war positions. The physical evidence from the battlefield sites has been slowly accumulating through archaeological surveys conducted by Indian state government authorities and independent researchers over the past 3 decades. Excavations near Ferozeshah and Sobraon have recovered military equipment, personal effects, and burial evidence consistent with the scale of casualties described in contemporary accounts. Isotopic analysis of skeletal remains from some burial sites has provided demographic information about the soldiers who died, ages, geographic origins based on childhood diet, evidence of previous injuries that adds texture to the aggregate casualty figures. None of this physical evidence resolves the question of betrayal, but it confirms the human scale of what happened on these battlefields in ways that documentary sources alone cannot convey. The Koh-i-Noor's current location in the Tower of London is a specific physical focal point for the broader question of what the British Empire took from the Sikh Empire and what, if anything, should be returned. The governments of India, Pakistan, Afghanistan and Iran have all at various points raised formal or informal claims to the diamond. The British government's consistent position has been that the transfer was legal under the terms of a valid treaty and that the diamond will not be returned. Sikh advocacy organisations dispute both the legality of the transfer on the grounds that a 10-year-old Maharaja signing under duress cannot be held to have provided valid consent, and the moral framework that treats colonial-era transfers of cultural property as permanently settled transactions. The warrior tradition that the Khalsa embodied did not die with the empire. Sikh soldiers served in the British Indian Army after 1849, with a distinction that became one of the most celebrated military records in colonial history, fighting in campaigns from Afghanistan to East Africa to the Western Front in World War I. The British military's recognition that Sikh soldiers were among the most reliable and capable in their service reflected a genuine appreciation of the Khalsa tradition, and also, less comfortably, reflected the specific ways in which colonised people's military virtues could be absorbed and redirected in service of the colonising power's objectives. The question that the Sikh Empire's history most insistently raises is not primarily military or diplomatic. It is political and moral. An army that had never been defeated on the battlefield lost an empire because its leadership sold it. The soldiers who died at Ferozeshah and Sobraon, men of genuine courage and genuine commitment, were betrayed not by an enemy's strength, but by the weakness of the men who were supposed to lead them. That betrayal was enabled by the British intelligence operation that identified which leaders were purchasable and at what price. But the fundamental act was committed by Sikhs, against an army, and a people who deserved better than what their court gave them. History assigns its verdicts slowly and incompletely. The commanders who sold the Anglo-Sikh Wars, if the evidence is read as implying that, lived out their lives and died in circumstances that did not include formal accountability. The soldiers they betrayed are buried near Ferozepur and Sobreon, in graves that most of the world has never heard of, having died for an empire that their own leaders had already agreed to surrender. Ranjit Singh built something extraordinary from a territory that every previous power had treated as a corridor rather than a country. He built it through personal genius, political skill, and a consistent ability to see the person in front of him as an individual rather than as a category. When he was gone, the people who inherited his creation could not agree on who it belonged to, and so they sold it to the one party that was willing to pay. The Punjab is still there. The 5 rivers still flow. The Golden Temple still stands, covered in the gold that Ranjit Singh placed on it 2 centuries ago, and the community that built the Khalsa Army still maintains the tradition of service that made that army what it was. What was lost was not the land. What was lost was the political vision that had made the land, briefly, into something more than what geography alone could have produced. That is the story of the Sikh Empire, and the question it leaves, whether the people who inherit something extraordinary are ever equal to what they have been given, is one that history asks of every generation without exception. There is a collection of documents in the British Library's India Office records, specifically in the Political and Secret Department files for 1844 through 1849, that historians of the Anglo-Sikh Wars have been studying and debating for decades. These files contain the political agents' correspondence from Ludhiana and Ferozepur, the Governor-General's private communications with his military commanders, and the intelligence assessments prepared by the company's officers in advance of and during the campaigns. What these files show, taken together, is a British intelligence operation of considerable sophistication, one that had identified the specific vulnerabilities of the Sikh court's political structure and was actively working to exploit them. The reports name individuals, they describe meetings, they record, in the careful language of official correspondence, assessments of which Sikh commanders were amenable to reason. The phrase that appears repeatedly in communications discussing the prospects for a successful British campaign. Historians who have worked most closely with these files include Shushwant Singh, whose 2-volume History of the Sikh People remains the standard scholarly account, and Patwant Singh, whose The Sikhs examines the community's history from its founding to the present. Both acknowledge the intelligence dimension of the Anglo-Sikh Wars, while differing somewhat in their assessments of how decisive the betrayal element was relative to straightforward military factors. The Ferozepur engagement of December 21 and 22, 1845 is the specific battle that draws the most historical scrutiny. The Sikh artillery at Ferozepur was positioned on elevated ground, with clear fields of fire against the advancing British columns. Governor-General Hardinge, who was present on the battlefield, an unusual circumstance for a senior civilian official, later wrote in his private correspondence that he believed the battle's outcome had been closer than the official dispatches acknowledged, and that the silencing of the Sikh guns at critical moments had been decisive. His correspondence does not explain why the guns fell silent. The Sikh commander Lal Singh, who commanded the Sikh forces at Ferozepur, was subsequently tried by a Sikh court of inquiry after the war and found guilty of treachery. He was exiled from Punjab. The British provided him with a pension. The pension detail is the specific piece of evidence that historians find most difficult to interpret charitably. Governments do not typically pension the commanders of enemy forces they have just defeated in a legitimate military contest. They do sometimes pension individuals who have provided services that cannot be publicly acknowledged. The Sobreon engagement of February 10, 1846, the final major battle of the First Anglo-Sikh War, provides the second key piece of evidence. At Sobreon, the Sikh forces were defending a fortified bridgehead on the south bank of the Sutlej, with their backs to the river. The British attack, which began in the early morning, faced Sikh artillery and infantry resistance that the attackers themselves described as fierce. Then, at a moment when the British advance had stalled and a Sikh counterattack with the cavalry reserve might have reversed the engagement, Tej Singh, the overall Sikh commander, withdrew the cavalry and crossed the river, cutting the pontooned bridge behind him and trapping the remaining Sikh infantry without a line of retreat. The trapped Sikh infantry continued fighting until they were killed or captured. British casualty reports from Sobraon record that Sikh soldiers fought until there was nowhere to retreat and no possibility of survival, choosing death over surrender. The courage of the men who died at Sobraon is not in historical dispute. The behaviour of the commander who put them in that position by withdrawing the cavalry and destroying the bridge is harder to explain in purely military terms. Tej Singh, like Lal Singh, was subsequently tried and exiled. He too received a British pension. The pattern held consistently. The men most credibly accused of betrayal received British financial support after the war. The men who fought and died received graves near Firozapur that most of the world has never visited. This record does not prove a conspiracy in the legal sense. It is circumstantial, and military history contains many examples of commanders making catastrophically wrong decisions under pressure without any corrupt motivation. What it does show is that the British intelligence apparatus understood the Sikh court's vulnerabilities in extraordinary detail, and that the outcomes of the Anglo-Sikh Wars followed a pattern consistent with those vulnerabilities having been systematically exploited. The Sikh Empire's soldiers deserved better leaders than they got in 1845 and 1846. Whether the leaders they got were simply incompetent or were deliberately corrupt is a question that the historical record supports asking and does not fully answer. It is a question that the Sikh community has been asking with increasing sophistication and access to archival sources for 175 years. The Golden Temple still stands. The graves near Firozapur are mostly unmarked, and the Koh-i-Noor, which passed through more hands and more empires than any other object in South Asian history, catches the light in a case in the Tower of London and waits, as it has always waited, for whoever comes next to claim it